Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization, its staff, I want to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Arjun Singh Sethi, Navyug Gill, and Manpreet Kaur Kalra as part of our Civic series. I'm sorry, there is a small problem with my text, but you know what, I'm just gonna have to skip ahead. Sorry about that. Tonight's conversation will run about an hour, including question and answers. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so please submit yours at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857 as noted in our chat. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question, as we like to say. And for those who would like to view the program with closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player, and the program will be available for rewatching immediately following the event. Town Hall is adding new programs every day. Upcoming events include the Institute for Systems Biology's presentation of Dr. Temple Grandin. She encourages us all to embrace a spirit of scientific inquiry as we encounter the world around us. Charles Wolfe, in conversation with In the Moment senior correspondent Steve Scher, discussing strategies for creating a distinctive city culture. And housing expert Dana Borland, examining the intersection of the housing crisis and the climate crisis. You can check out more of the upcoming programs between now and, say, the end of June by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs come courtesy the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. And with that, Arjun Singh Sethi is a human rights lawyer, professor, author, and community activist based in Washington, D.C. Actually just characterized himself to me as a professional troublemaker. So D.C. is a very fine place to do that work. He works closely with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian and Sikh communities and holds faculty appointments at Georgetown University Law Center and Vanderbilt University Law School. He is the author of 2018's American Hate, Survivors Speak Out, which documents interviews with a diverse range of people who experienced hate during the 2016 election. Sethi also serves as co-chair of the American Bar Association's Committee on Homeland Security, Terrorism, and Treatment of Enemy Combatants, and has served as a legal observer across the world, including military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. Navyug Gill is assistant professor in the Department of History at William Patterson University in New Jersey. His research explores questions of agrarian change, labor politics, caste hierarchy, post-colonial critique, and global capitalism. His academic and popular writings have appeared in publications including the Journal of Asian Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, Al Jazeera, Law and Political Economy Project, and Borderlines. And he is currently at work on a book describing the emergence of the peasant and the rule of capital in colonial Punjab. Manpreet Kaur Kalra is a social impact advisor, anti-racism educator, and Seattle-based activist working to decolonize storytelling. Her activism focuses on the interconnectivity of economic, social, and climate justice. And to advance this work, she founded Art of Citizenry, which helps impact-driven businesses and organizations to address inclusion in all aspects, from business development to marketing strategy. Manpreet is the host of the Art of Citizenry podcast. She serves on the board of the NYC Fair Trade Coalition and co-established the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Community of the Fair Trade Federation. Tonight's discussion will excavate the history of industrialized agriculture in India, as well as the geopolitical factors influencing the protests unfolding there in response to legislation passed just last year by the government of Narendra Modi. Please join me in welcoming Arjun Singh Sethi, Navyug Gill, and Manpreet Kaur Kalra.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. I want to welcome everyone to today's conversation. I will be moderating the conversation today. I want to extend a special thank you to both Navyug and Arjun for sharing their expertise, knowledge, and time with all of us. I also want to extend my eternal gratitude to Town Hall for creating space for this important conversation. As a member, it really is a great way to be able to share something that is impacting the community, the Punjabi, Sikh, and South Asian diaspora community of Seattle with all of you as well. We'll be speaking about some emotionally challenging topics. And so I just want to take a moment to remind anyone, if at any point you need to step away, that is completely fine, and we truly understand. I know that sometimes some of these topics, especially when talking about human rights, can be very triggering. I also want to just capture for a moment the state of affairs that we're working in. We are 6 months into the farmers' protest in India. In September 2020, the Indian government passed 3 new agricultural bills that deregulate and privatize India's agricultural industry. Since then, farmers and farm workers across India have taken to the country's capital, staging the largest protest in human history. Small-scale farming is being replaced by industrialized agriculture, a topic that so many of us, even in the state of Washington, are very well aware of, which essentially industrialized agriculture is essentially large-scale farming, rejecting generational knowledge on farming in favor of chemical fertilizers and expensive high-yielding seeds. In the United States, industrialized agriculture is the dominant food production system. This understanding of agriculture has been spread globally through the Green Revolution, which started in Mexico, eventually spreading to India, and now actively occurring across regions throughout Africa. The region first impacted by the Green Revolution in India was the northern state of Punjab because of its rich agricultural history. It is often coined as the breadbasket of India. Over the years, the move towards industrialized agriculture has not only depleted the land, but also resulted in great harm to the people and environment. This understanding is so important to truly unpack why the farmers and farm workers across India have been protesting now for over 6 months, and how the bills further threaten to erode the livelihoods of small farmers. So to start really unpacking these layers, I want to start with understanding the bills at hand. Navyug, farmers have been now protesting for quite some time. Can you break down the bills a bit and share what is at stake?
Sure. So first, thank you, Manpreet, for organizing this conversation. And I salute Town Hall Seattle for creating the space to have, bring sort of these issues to the fore. And also thanks to Ware and Olivia and Bruno and Gagan and everybody else on the team. These bills that have become law, what we have to understand first is that the bills were introduced by the right-wing BJP government in June in the middle of a pandemic lockdown. No farmer or labor or union leader was consulted. There was no impending sort of agrarian crisis that required them. And then they were pushed through in a special session of parliament in September without due legal process. These bills are against the Indian Constitution because agriculture is supposed to be a state subject, yet the federal government is imposing them across the country. So what are these bills? Well, the first law allows private corporations to purchase crops directly from farmers outside of government procurement markets at market prices. And the change here is that before there was a system set up where farmers would sell their produce in government markets at minimum support prices. So this first law creates a parallel private system and allows private players to buy crops directly. The second law allows corporations to stockpile grain in unlimited quantities. So they can buy when prices are low, they can hold and hoard them and wait for prices to rise and then sell. The change here is that before there were limitations on essential commodities to prevent exactly this kind of speculation. And so the government didn't allow corporations to engage in such tactics. The third law allows corporations to engage in lopsided contracts with farmers without legal recourse. And the change here is that before there were prohibitions on these kinds of asymmetrical arrangements, and farmers were sort of protected from that. If we think about what a contract is, it presupposes equality between two parties, and there is no equality between a sort of marginal farmer and a large corporation. So taken together, there is a lot of this sort of language of choice and freedom, but what these laws will do effectively is deregulate and privatize the agricultural sector. And they're designed to empower private corporations to control the agricultural sort of supply chain. What is at stake is the entire food supply of 1.4 billion people and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of farmers and people dependent on agriculture. These laws will eventually lead to the destruction of small-scale independent cultivation simply for the benefit of private interests. So the stakes couldn't be clearer and they couldn't be greater.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things I think you mentioned early on that's so important is we see this in global development across the board, right? Is what we see oftentimes is those who are most impacted by initiatives, laws, regulations, and so forth do not have a seat at the decision-making table. And so their opinions are not influencing the way that we are thinking about solutions or the way that we are even thinking about the bills or regulations that are going to be impacting their livelihoods. The other thing that I think you mentioned that's so important for us to remember is we can talk a lot about the impact of the bills on small farmers and farm workers because they are directly being impacted. We can see that. But what you said that I really, you know, we've seen this in the United States, we've seen this across the board globally, is at the end of the day, those who are also going to be impacted are just people, right? The food system is what's being challenged. And if you have corporations essentially able to control the pricing of crops, you're going to be able to see, what we're going to see is the cost of crops is going to go up. And those who are just part of the population, they're citizens, they're, you know, individuals living in an economy, they're the ones who are going to struggle because at the end of the day, being able to afford those crops that are being regulated, their prices are being regulated is a problem. And so the other thing that I think is just so important to that's so important to recognize in this moment is that we can often talk about situations like the farmers' protest or COVID crisis in India, which is a whole other issue in silo. But I would argue that the farmers' protest is a response to decades of systemic injustice. Arjun, I would love to hear your thoughts on what are the various layers of inequities influencing the protests that we need to start unpacking and to really understand.
Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Town Hall Seattle for convening this important conversation. You know, for a long time, India has been protected under the moniker world's largest democracy. But I think if one probes more deeply, I think a more appropriate moniker is world's largest authoritarian regime. And I say that because democracies only work if people can speak freely, organize freely, write freely, associate freely. Democracies only work if there's actually a meaningful interplay and balance of power between the federal government, state governments, and you have an independent judiciary that can serve as a check. And what we've seen really throughout Indian history is just sort of a compromising of these democratic institutions and a move towards authoritarianism, which in so many ways has culminated with the Modi regime. And so a few things I just wanted to sort of, you know, put out there to help kind of orient the conversation. One is this idea of Hindutva nationalism. This idea that India is meant to be first and foremost a Hindu nation, and anybody who belongs to a faith that is perceived to be not perceived not to be indigenous to India is considered a foreigner, whether it's Muslims, whether it's Christians and the like. And so the idea is that Hindus enjoy first-class citizenship and everybody else enjoys second and third-class citizenship. And that manifests in lots of ways, as you can imagine. So it shouldn't be surprising that these bills disproportionately impact, for example, Sikhs in Punjab, in part because, right, Sikhs aren't Hindus and the like. We've obviously seen a persecution of religious minorities. There is the Gujarat pogrom of 2002. There were decades of atrocities committed against Sikhs across Punjab. And again, to this day, survivors across India are still seeking accountability. Now, we're going to talk about Modi and his particular circumstance later, but it's important to sort of say that from the outset. Look at Kashmir. Look at the what they have endured. Just recently, the autonomy of the region was revoked without consultation with the people, without any stakeholder from Kashmir having a seat at the table. And absolutely, when we think about socioeconomic issues and we think about broader issues of climate justice, for the most part, and I think this is the case in India, but I think it's also the case across the world. One of the great gulfs that we are trying to navigate across the world is the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so while it's true that India has a middle class, we've nevertheless seen that despite its growing middle class, there are still lots of people who are being left behind. There is still not a social safety net. When push comes to shove, stakeholders like the farmers of Punjab and farmers across India often don't have a seat at the table, nor do Dalit laborers, nor do Muslim laborers. And that's in part sort of, what got us here today.
Just for anyone listening, would you, Arjun, be able to provide a little context around what the term Dalit means, just so we can make sure everyone knows?
Sure, I'm happy to answer it. I'm also happy for my colleague, because I know my colleague Professor Gill has actually done a lot of research and work on this. Did you want to answer that?
Sure. Dalit is a word that actually means broken down and sort of crushed people. And it's a word that emerged in the sort of 20th century, taken up by ex-untouchable groups in India. This is something like 20–30% of the population are excluded and marginalized and subordinated systemically through the caste system for centuries. And so they've gone through various iterations for scheduled castes and untouchables and Harijans. And this is a term, Dalit, that they have claimed for themselves and use it to kind of empower themselves as a way to kind of mark their history and make a claim to being part of society. They don't consider, most of them belong to different religions. Some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are Sikh, some are Hindu, some are Buddhist, and they sort of span across the country. But these are the lowest of the low, most exploited and excluded, yet have asserted themselves and sort of fought to create a new space for their communities in India and in the subcontinent.
Thank you so much, Navyug, for that. I also want to ask you, what are some of, Navyug, your background's a lot in the historical context. And so I would love to hear more about what are some of the various layers of inequities that you also have observed that are influencing the protest.
Sure. The layers of inequities in terms of within the struggle itself?
Within the struggle itself, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it is an incredible sort of mass mobilization. And you mentioned this actually in your previous comment about how these laws are going to affect all of society. So the struggle began when the bills were first announced in June with farmer and laborer unions in Punjab and Haryana. But very soon they sort of spread and other groups became involved. Because when these laws sort of, if they go forward, they are going to actually have a kind of ripple effect. First, if these corporations are empowered, what they're going to engage in is a kind of bait and switch tactic. right? They might put prices a little bit lower to entice farmers to kind of, go to the private markets. Once farmers start selling to them, the public markets will eventually collapse and wither away. And then the private corporations will control the entire food supply chain. What that will mean is they will dictate production, they will dictate storage and distribution. So from the sort of field to the retail store. And when they control that supply chain, all of the small shopkeepers who actually sell grain at different rates in different places, they will be wiped out. The government of India actually has something called the public distribution system, which is a way of the government to kind of procure grain and distribute it at subsidized rates for its own citizens. Something like 60 to 70% of the Indian population has access to the PDS system. They depend on subsidized food. Once these laws pass and are implemented, the government will no longer have the ability to procure grains. And so you're going to witness the kind of collapse of the PDS system, which will affect huge swaths of the country. So so after the unions got involved, this very quickly became a kind of mass movement. And it received widespread support across Punjab and Haryana, as well as other states. In Uttar Pradesh, in Uttarakhand, in Rajasthan, but also Bengal and Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, delegations of farmers have come out, and laborers from those places have come to support the protest sites. They've also organized within their own states. So it really is a kind of mass upsurge against deregulation and privatization. At the same time, to your prompt, yes, there are sort of tensions and contradictions within the movement. And that is because, there's a difference between farmers who own land and the laborers who work alongside them. The laborers are often the employees of the farmers. And so there's a long kind of history of kind of hierarchy and exploitation there, the employer-employee relationship, especially because it maps onto caste divides. The farmers are usually Jat caste, which is a kind of agrarian land-holding caste, and the laborers are Dalits, which I've just explained. And so it kind of becomes economic as well as cultural. Nevertheless, these two groups have forged an impressive unity. And they sort of stood shoulder to shoulder in fighting against these laws. That doesn't mean that the tensions and differences have evaporated, right? But it doesn't mean that the solidarity is sort of fake and counterfeit. And I think this is something we've maybe encountered here as well. When disparate groups come together for an issue, differences remain, but there is a kind of meaningful solidarity that is produced because the threat facing them is so great.
Absolutely, absolutely. Arjun mentioned this a little earlier, India is the most populous democracy, right? And we have our challenges with even the term democracy being used with India, but that is what when we talk about the world's greatest democracy, the reason it's called that is because it's the most populous democracy. The Green Revolution promised self-sustainability to India as a nation. And instead of having to import crops to feed India's exponentially increasing population, India would be able to essentially produce enough crops to feed the masses, right? What ended up happening is this led to farmers being forced to use specific high-yielding seeds, which they were forced to purchase alongside the necessary chemicals at retail price, not wholesale. This resulted in immense increase of death and farmer suicides. We also saw that, when we're starting to talk about the Green Revolution, we cannot ignore the fact that so much generational knowledge was essentially rejected to this new form of farming. And much of the biodiversity that existed in Punjab was essentially diminished to the Green Revolution. For a global development effort with a lot of promise, essentially the Green Revolution caused incredible harm and continues to do so globally. We're seeing this currently again playing out in Africa as well. Navyug, can you tell us a little bit about what are ways in which the Green Revolution impacted the land and livelihoods of farmers in India? And what are some aspects that you believe are often overlooked in these conversations?
Sure. Yeah, so the Green Revolution, what we have to kind of understand is that, as you mentioned, and this is sort of maybe where the US is implicated in this struggle. And you know, for people listening here, it's not simply some sort of curiosity about learning about world affairs. No, the US is actually part of the problem, and we have to kind of own up to that. And it's part of the problem at two levels. So on the one hand, the United States government, through the State Department, as well as the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, were sponsored a set of technologies and strategies that became known as the Green Revolution. And they deployed these in different parts of the world. They were taken up in India in the 1960s. And the reason for this is that the Indian government faced a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, after 1947, after independence, India was an impoverished country. And there were sort of massive food shortages to the point of riots and even potential famine. At the same time, there were waves of leftist-inspired revolutions happening across the decolonizing world in the 40s and the 50s and 60s. So the Indian government was concerned about potential famine and potential communist uprising. And so they teamed up with the US State Department and the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations and brought about what became known as the Green Revolution. It was named that in opposition to a red revolution. So this entailed, as you mentioned, the introduction of hybrid high-yield seed varieties, chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and mechanization through tractors and tubals. And the goal was to dramatically increase food production, right? That was the objective. And they deployed these technologies in Punjab, especially because it had incredibly fertile soil and groundwater, but also because it had an experienced smallholding cultivator community. So on the one hand, the US sort of pushed these technologies onto India at the time and ensured they were adopted, and the Indian government went along with it and implemented it in Punjab, and it led to kind of massive increase in food output. India became food self-sufficient, and that's where the moniker of Punjab being the breadbasket came about. On the other hand, though, more recently, for the last 3 decades, the US has been insisting that countries in the global south end their supports and protections for their farmers while keeping intact subsidies for their own large agribusinesses. So this is the glaring hypocrisy of the global order, that the US demands countries like India, through the IMF and World Bank and others, end subsidies and dismantle their kind of food systems while keeping them intact here. And US farmers, I mean, it's a kind of misnomer. The average landholding size in the US is something like 800 or 900 acres. The average landholding size in India is about 4, maybe 3 acres. So these are not farmers of the same scale. So that is why I think we all have a duty to support this struggle and challenge our government to not put forward this disastrous sort of maniacal privatization agenda that is wreaking havoc across the world. We are actually part of the problem, and we have to be a part of the solution.
Absolutely. You know, this actually brings us to an audience question, which I would love to open to both of you. Is someone just asked, how can we truly help the farmers if we're all the way in the US? Arjun, would you like to start?
Sure. I think just sort of education and how we frame the conversation again is very important. Again, for too long, India has escaped criticism under this moniker, world's largest democracy. For too long, even philanthropists haven't actually supported international organizations, domestic organizations who have wanted to do work in India for decades, under the theory that there were countries that had bigger issues. And now here we are, and we look at sort of like global fascism, and you know, Trump obviously came to mind, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Modi in India. They're sort of the trifecta. So I think philanthropists need to be more attentive. I think there are lots of advocacy organizations here in the United States who are trying to do work. They're often under-resourced, they're often underfunded. You know, there are lawyers who recently wrote a letter to President Biden urging him to act and to support the farmers. That letter was published and carried by The Wire. I think something like 40 lawyers, US lawyers of South Asian descent signed it. Here's the thing. This struggle should also concern journalists, because we've seen, I know we're going to talk about this, journalists who've reported on the farmers' protests have been arrested. It should concern people who are committed to free speech, because the Indian government leads the world in internet shutdowns and has repeatedly blocked the internet in and around Delhi and other places where folks have mobilized. It should concern people who care about a free and social media, right? Because the Indian government has forced social media companies to remove Twitter posts, Instagram posts, posts on Facebook. There should be a letter from people who are concerned with climate change and degradation of the environment, people who are concerned about food security, right? Because as we pointed out, right, this concerns Punjab, which is the breadbasket of India, and in some cases, even broader South Asia. And so when I look at the farmers' protest, I think it's at the intersection of so many different human rights issues, both in terms of what gave rise to it, but also in terms of the viciousness of the Indian government's response. And so if you are a member of any of those different communities, right, your voice matters in particular because it implicates all those issues. And if you don't think that you belong to one of those sectors, you can still be involved by encouraging your representatives to reach out, by encouraging your representatives to express concern, not just about the bills, but also about the violent response of the Indian government towards the farmers.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that those are important points. I think we also have maybe a duty here to learn from this struggle, right? What we're witnessing is, as I said, astounding, that people determined to defend their collective livelihood have engaged in a collective fight for 6 months at the borders of Delhi, right? They braved the bitter cold. They're into the kind of searing summer heat. There's been power outages and problems with, supplies and attacks by right-wing goons and police repression. They have persevered through all of that. They have set up, clinics and food arrangements. Something like 500 people have died in the course of this struggle. They've done it throughout the pandemic. So it's incredibly inspiring because usually here, protests are about expression, about sort of raising one's voice against something. And once you kind of feel that your voice has been heard or not heard, people sort of just go home. This is a mass-based, sustained struggle. These people are not going home, and they're determined to fight. And I think we actually have a lesson to learn, that if we want to get something done, if we're committed to something, then it can't be sort of momentary, it can't be transient, it requires a deeper level of commitment. And so here, for folks here, I mean, one is to obviously find out whatever city you happen to live in, there will be people that have been organizing these protests in front of Indian consulates and embassies and elsewhere. So get involved, plug in. There's places to donate your time and other resources, but also the demands we make to our government representatives have to be crystal clear. One, we have to oppose the privatization agenda that has wrecked this world. The kind of neoliberal logic that thinks deregulation and privatization and financialization is the solution to every problem is false, and it has to be challenged. Secondly, we have to kind of engage in local struggles here, the corporations that are doing this for our livelihoods, and the fact that the US government is imposing this kind of privatization agenda on other governments in the global south. So it happens at two levels. It's a kind of private corporation as well as the kind of deregulation agenda from government to government relations. So I think there's lots of space for people to get involved, but we have to take struggle seriously. There's a reason why it's called struggle. It's not easy, it's not convenient.
Absolutely. I actually, both of you said some really important points that I want to reiterate. One of them is, Navyug, you just mentioned this, and Town Hall is based in Seattle. So for anyone who is tuning in, is Seattle based, we are, the Gates Foundation is based in Seattle. And the Gates Foundation has been leading a lot of the efforts around the Green Revolution in Africa. In fact, if you go to the visitor center, they're one of their biggest, displays is about high yielding seeds. And so it's important to recognize that there are initiatives that are taking place even within Seattle around AgriWatch and so forth that I encourage you to really reach out and learn about. And in regards to the farmers' protest, this is a moment for us to realize that these issues are not just isolated to India. They are very much also part of how we are operating in the systems that we're operating in the United States as well. I recognize that, there's two. The first thing is that all of us here, we are in the diaspora and having this conversation. I recognize that we don't have someone who's actively on the ground, part of this conversation. But I think that the reason for that is because we need to also unpack the layers in which these same issues are influencing how we are navigating within our own societies here domestically as well in the US. And so as part of, for me, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is this idea that we also need to see how our food system within the United States is very much influenced by industrialized agriculture, supporting small farmers, shopping at farmers markets, buying directly from farmers is one step that we can take that's very easy and very tangible. The other thing is, Arjun, you mentioned this earlier, is this issue is multifaceted. There are so many layers to the problem at hand that we need to really, almost anyone with any sort of layer of interest can have some feeling of connectedness to the problem with the farmers' protest. One of the things you did mention, though, is just global governments. How are they responding, right? This letter went out and I had a chance to read over the letter earlier when it was first published. How are global governments responding? I recognize that, there's diplomatic relations and there's hesitations. And then the common argument I've heard is we cannot dictate how another government is choosing to operate, which is ridiculous to me, and I'm sure you can elaborate more on that. But can you tell us a little bit about how global governments are responding at this time and what some of the hesitations might be?
Global governments are not doing enough. I think that's fair to say, plain and simple. And, truthfully, I think this has been an issue for the entirety of the Modi regime. And the farmers' protest is just, I would say, sort of the latest mass violation. When you look at the Citizenship Amendment Act, that's a bill that's on its face openly discriminates against Muslims, right? It deprioritizes Muslims from getting citizenship in India. International bodies like the UNHCR have called it fundamentally discriminatory. You've got the NRC, the National Registry of Citizenship. We've seen what it does in Assam. The government says this is just a census and this is just a mechanism to ensure that those who are on Indian soil are in fact citizens. But in fact, it is a mechanism to actually disenfranchise Muslims, Dalits, the impoverished and women from actually remaining in India as full-fledged citizens, which is in many cases exactly what they are. We've also seen with respect to the revocation of Kashmir a few years ago, which also saw the longest internet blackout in the history of the internet. And so whether it was NRC, whether it was CAA, whether it was Kashmir, and now with respect to the farmers' protest, we have found again that for the most part, the Indian government gets a pass. And they get a pass both because lots of US corporations, lots of international corporations want access to the Indian market. The US government and others also see India as an important strategic ally vis-a-vis China, which is considered in so many ways to be the US, China, to be sort of the next iteration of the Cold War. And to be clear, right, what a change of circumstances, right? It wasn't too long ago that Narendra Modi was the only human being to be banned from the United States under the Religious Freedom Act, right? And he was banned from entering this country because of his role in the Gujarat pogrom. And for those who want to study that deeper, there are plenty of wonderful resources out there. But to be clear, it was in 2002. It was a mass pogrom and slaughter of Muslims. There were police and both murderers who actually had the names and addresses of Muslim residents in Gujarat. In some cases, the police stood by. In other cases, they actually participated. And to this day, there has been no accountability. And so it's a very unfortunate turn of events. But the fact is that the US should be doing more, and world governments need to be doing more. But because of India's mass market, because of their growing economic potential, and because of their geopolitical strategic possibilities vis-a-vis China, Indian human rights atrocities are often deprioritized.
Yeah, I would just quickly add. I mean, the kind of, when you hear this claim, and I think it's valuable that you mention it. When you get some politicians saying that we can't dictate policy in other countries, and so they can make some mealy-mouthed kind of statement, but they got to kind of hold back. We should be clear: this is nonsense. It's untrue. That the U.S. government, the Republican Party, and the Democrats, it's a kind of consensus, has been pushing this agenda of privatization and deregulation across the global South. So they already are pushing an agenda. They are absolutely involved, directly as well as through these other sort of bodies like the IMF and the World Bank. And then, of course, backing sort of private interests like Cargill International and Walmart and others who have their eyes, as Arjun said, on the Indian market. So they're already doing this. We have to kind of expose this lie. Now they're doing it in league with Indian elites, right-wing Indian elites, the BJP, as well as the Congress Party. There's a kind of consensus there as well that puts forward this neoliberal agenda. So, and as you said, Manpreet, there's this kind of cabal of sort of philanthropists, these sort of billionaires that are trying to kind of launder their personalities and histories, are actively pushing this as well. So the question I think to ask then is, with the claim of democracy, the so-called largest democracy, the so-called oldest democracy, what is democracy? Is democracy merely winning an election? Who gets to vote? How are elections organized? Is there a deeper, larger, more ambitious, more creative way to decide what people are interested in? What happens when governments pursue interests that will actually harm the vast majority of their people? Can we still say this is democratic? So I think that is actually what maybe is on the table at a kind of conceptual issue, but as well as at a political issue.
Absolutely. And, you know, this really brings us to an important question. Both of you have mentioned these global systems and entities that are influencing and have a role to play with the farmers' protest and our global supply chains and food systems. So I would love to start, Navyug, with you, and then Arjun, if you have any comments, please do jump in. How have power and global systems such as the USAID influenced what we are seeing play out currently in India with the farmers' protest and historically with industrialized agriculture? We have an audience question that I'm going to follow up with after this one.
Sure. So I'll say, I mean, this is kind of a bit of what we discussed earlier, but I think with programs like USAID, with the kind of entire discourse of development, I think the first thing to kind of recognize is maybe the most basic point, which is the immense diversity of the planet, right? That you know, we're living on this kind of planet with 7 or so billion people, and one size fits all models do not work. They don't capture the kind of differences, nuances, different histories and politics and environments across the world. So that should be on the face of it. In terms of India, we should recognize that this country is 74 years old. It's the same age as Pakistan. And as a country, 1.4 billion people, there's 20 official languages. There's 100 languages with 1 million or more speakers, incredibly diverse in terms of religion and culture and history and politics. It has more diversity in every measure than all of Europe. So the situation of sort of farmers in, say, Punjab might not be identical to Bengal or Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu or Kerala. There are differences within the country as well. And so development actually has to be rethought. The kind of neoliberal model with the sort of oligarchy of right-wing politicians, philanthropists, and corporate interests, we have to kind of confront and oppose this and recognize that we have to develop localized, community-driven, democratic means of sort of controlling resources, as well as mechanisms for collective decision-making. Right? That is what has to kind of emerge so that people are kind of invested and have a say in governing their own lives and livelihoods. I should just quickly add that we actually do have these models. We don't have to kind of invent them out of the blue. They do exist. It's going to take a political struggle to bring them into being, to implement them. And that's what's happening at the borders of Delhi. It's a kind of fight to bring forward a new agrarian model based on localized control and people having a say in governing their livelihoods. And I think that's where we can kind of draw inspiration and rethink our lives here.
Absolutely. Arjun, did you want to jump in as well?
There was nothing for me to.
Okay. I wanted to, this is one of the audience questions. One of the things that I want to ask about is, someone asked, what would have been a more equitable way to increase food production? How should the Green Revolution have been conducted then?
It's a fantastic question. It's very important because usually programs like this are sort of presented as a fait accompli. As you know, there is actually no other possibilities. So increasing food production is a worthy objective, and lots of people sort of were eagerly sort of involved in this at the government level, but also at the local level. As this process was unfolding, there were critiques made at the time. Politicians, religious leaders, civil society groups, rural economists, all sorts of people recognized this model is not sustainable. This model does not belong in Punjab in this way, and it's actually going to lead to disastrous consequences. So you might get a rapid increase in food production for a decade or two, maybe 3, but if it tapers off and starts to wane, and you've destroyed your ecology, you've poisoned the soil, you've indebted farmers, there's mass suicides and cancer, is that success? Right? And I think it kind of reveals maybe the short-sightedness of the private model, because private corporations seek increase in profits every quarter and every year. And their sort of outlook is myopic by definition. But if you take a longer kind of view, you realize if we're trying to kind of sustain communities for half a century or a century, actually have to do something different. So people were at the time saying something like rice. If we give a concrete example, rice doesn't belong in Punjab. Mm-hmm. To grow paddy makes no sense because rice requires something like 10 to 12 inches of standing water for 5 or 6 months. And Punjab doesn't get those kinds of monsoons to sustain that kind of a crop. It belongs in places like Eastern India or Southern India. Nonetheless, because Punjab had groundwater supplies, they imposed rice on Punjab. They created the incentives that made farmers adopt it. And one of the things they did was provide loans for submersible water pumps. So individual farmers could dig wells and pump out water and make Punjab a rice growing region for half the year. And you know, the water table might have been 20 or 30 feet deep in some places in 1970. Today in those same places, the water table is 600 feet deep to get good water. So we don't have to grow rice. If we create other subsidies and other supports for other kinds of crops, nobody would grow rice anymore. Everybody I know that is actually growing rice right now doesn't want to, but they're kind of forced into it. So if one kind of reconfigures the support mechanisms and priorities based on local conditions, the model could be revamped. One other sort of quick point is that the protests that are happening now against these laws are not an endorsement of the status quo. Just because one opposes a kind of law that the government is opposing doesn't mean that they actually want what was before. or that they're satisfied with it. There's actually lots of debate, lots of very thoughtful, like I said, economists and scholars and union leaders that have kind of come up with different models. Do we have the patience to kind of hear and learn from them? And will their ideas be implemented? That is, I think, the kind of questions of the day.
I think that's such an important point, because we have to understand these bills are so harmful to farmers that they're willing to protest. And in some ways saying, like, just at least give us what it was before, to a certain degree.
Or we're not this. We actually want to do all sorts of different things. I mean, there's actually government commissions. The one is, for listeners, the Swaminathan Commission actually was, a government-sponsored body that did research into agriculture in the early 2000s, recognized all sorts of problems, from, land fragmentation to crop prices to the water table, and came up with solutions. And the government heard them and shelved it and ignored it completely. So people actually are saying, we don't want these laws that will kind of destroy agriculture. We want to implement the Swaminathan Commission. We want to implement other countless proposals that have been just discredited and ignored. So yeah, it is absolutely like, wanting to not have the kind of knife kind of plunge into agriculture, but actually there's all sorts of other things too that people are fighting for.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think is so important to recognize is the way that the Green Revolution essentially was carried out in India, but in particularly in Punjab, was it limited the crop production to certain crops. And Navyug, you alluded to this earlier, is the two crops that were became very primary in Punjab were wheat and paddy, or rice before it's husked. And so what this meant is the biodiversity that existed in the region was essentially diminished. And so Punjab as a state became hard for Punjab to be self-sustaining. And that's also a cost of the Green Revolution that we cannot continue to ignore. I do want to bring the conversation to something, Arjun, that you mentioned is human rights violations are baked into every aspect of how we slice and dice the current situation with the farmers' protests, right? When the protests started 6 months ago, a lot of the global stage was very focused on the human rights violations aspects, in particular around the protests. Can you talk a little bit about what is the state of human rights in India? What have been some of the violations that we're seeing play out, and why we should be concerned in the diaspora?
Sure. So I talked in my earlier comments a little bit about the Citizenship Amendment Act, the NRC, the revocation of the autonomy of Kashmir, and the human rights violations we saw there, including the detention of children, the torture of children. So many people were arrested. In some cases, they had to literally take people away, Kashmiris 2,000 miles away, and put them in other jails. We've seen that India is the leader in global internet blackouts. Hate violence targeting Muslims, Dalits, Christians, and others is so commonplace in India today that those acts are often organized on social media and the videos are uploaded online for the world to see. So that's just the context of the last several years, since Modi took office. And really what we've seen with respect to the farmers' protests, we've seen the government respond through violence, unlawful detention, and censorship. And so for those who have been following and for those who have not, you can, go on social media. You can go back to reporting from, BBC, and you will see videos of plainclothed assailants attacking protesters. You will see videos of security forces, in some cases in Delhi, actually participating in those attacks against protesters. There is the case of Dr. Swaminathan Singh, who's a medical professional, a U.S. citizen from New Jersey, who was actually in Delhi at the time in January. And he was badly beaten while providing medical aid to protesters. 3 of his colleagues had different limbs broken by the Indian government. We've also seen that the police and the military have erected fortifications with large metal spikes around some of these protest sites. As I mentioned before, in some cases, the Indian government has periodically actually blocked the internet. The Indian government has told social media outlets, including Twitter, Instagram, that they can't include posts of people actually uploading videos of the protest. In some cases, journalists who've truthfully reported about the protests have actually faced criminal charges. The editor of The Caravan, the editor of The Wire are facing sedition charges, or at least as of recently facing sedition charges. The government has invoked various draconian laws, including Section 144 of the Indian Penal Code, which prohibits the assembly of 5 or more people, and the National Security Act, which allows the state to preemptively detain individuals for 1 year on the grounds of national security. So that's what we've been seeing, right? We've really been seeing, with respect to the farmers' protests, a lot of what we saw with respect to CAA and NRC, which is government violence, mob violence, unlawful detention, censorship, and the chilling of free speech and association.
I really appreciate that. And I know that we are coming to the top of the hour, but I do want to conclude with this question that actually piggybacks off of what you just said, Arjun. And I want to open it to both of you. So as Sikhs, the month of June weighs heavy on our hearts because this year marks the 37-year anniversary since the attacks on Darbar Sahib, also commonly referred to as the Golden Temple, by the Indian government, which led to a mass ongoing genocide. What does justice look like in response to the farmers' protest and beyond? I would love to start with you, Arjun.
Well, you know, on a really basic level, when I think about the farmers' protests, as has been mentioned, these laws were passed without consultation with those who were most impacted, namely the farmers, without the consultation of union leaders. And so I think what the farmers want is really what all workers across the world want, which is a fair share, an ownership stake in their production, an ownership stake in their share. And so I think that is the solution. Now, how we craft that, I would ultimately leave to the policymakers. I would leave to the scholars and the union leaders. I think it's also safe to say that, you know, there are some who are participating in the farmers' protest, in particular the Sikhs of Punjab, for whom this is doubly and triply compounding, right? Because for them, they were impacted by the 84 attack. They were impacted by the pogroms that followed after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and they were impacted by the decade of extrajudicial disappearances, mass murders, and impunity that saw the Indian government literally wipe out entire villages across Punjab. There are villages in India today, in Punjab, where you will not find young Sikh men because they were murdered. And so for me, when I think about justice with respect to Punjab and, 1984 and the atrocities that followed, for me, that means a government apology. It means reparations, and it means holding those accountable to justice. And with respect to the farmers' protest, it means respecting the farmers' right to associate, to gather, to protest, and ensuring that, again, they have a seat at the table, and that they have a fair shake, which is really what workers across the world are asking.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for putting this very sort of difficult issue on the table. It is an incredibly challenging time for the Sikh community, but I think people, decent, good-meaning people across the world who know about the kind of horrors of June 1984. There's a kind of call to kind of remember 84, never forget 84. And I think what the farmer struggle is having us sort of also think about, it's the resilience of our community and the fact that in addition to kind of remembering and not forgetting, there is a deeper commitment to fighting for justice and pursuing justice wherever it might lead. So I think that for the kind of perpetrators of the attack on the Darbar Sahib, there's absolutely a need not just to not forget what happened, but to actually fight to achieve justice in whatever it means in that context of, have that account actually take place. And we can draw on Sikh history for that. The spirit of Chardi Kala, the spirit of kind of upward spirits and determination and not sort of becoming despondent, I think is what has kept us in strength all this time. And it's also what has inspired this farmers' protest and farmers' struggle to kind of continue all these months, and the determination to kind of see it through to the end. So I think that it's a deeper kind of broader kind of sense that drives people to kind of fight for their collective well-being, and I think it's present in all of us and across the world.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for sharing space and sharing your expertise and insights with all of us. I want to, I think at this moment, hand over the stage to Olivia from Town Hall to wrap us up. But I really just want to thank everyone, and thank you, Town Hall, for having us and
thank you, Manpreet,
hosting this conversation.
Yeah, organizing this and doing such an amazing job to bring us all together. And we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mostly just want to echo that sentiment and say a huge thank you on behalf of Town Hall to the three of you for spending this hour with us and sharing your knowledge and expertise on the subject. And thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.